Hi, Jason.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
I can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Jason Ponton. Did I pronounce the second name right?
That is absolutely accurate.
Absolutely. Well, you are how should I describe you? You know a lot about technology. For a long time, you were editor and publisher of Technology Review, the magazine put out by MIT, and one of the few university-associated magazines whose significance transcends the institution, I think. I mean, Tech Review has long been taken as just a magazine you need to read if you're interested in the present and future of technology. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, there are two other university publications that transcend their institutional ownership. One is Harvard Business Review, which serves the business community. And then there is a wonderful and too little read publication called Virginia Quarterly Review, or VQR, published out of the University of Virginia, that does wonderful photographs and essays and short stories, which I really recommend to your audience as well.
Well, there are a number of probably literary reviews associated with universities. I don't know the landscape, that are certainly more than house organs, right?
Yeah.
VQR
VQR is a real national publication. It's won a lot of national magazine awards. And when I think of the universe I used to occupy, are publications that are in business, but which have a function to describe a broader world. HBR and VQR were the ones I used to think about.
Okay. So in addition to having done that for more than 10 years, you are a contributor. What is it called? You're an ideas contributor, Wired or something, which I am too, by way of full disclosure.
I know.
Although you're more prolific than I am, I think.
Yeah, but you wrote a great piece last year about moral intuitions in the age of social media that was very much read. But we are peers as an ideas contributor at Wired. I also write for Wired magazine, and I'm a kind of venture capitalist at a company called Flagship Pioneering that mainly creates companies in life sciences and healthcare and in agriculture.
Right. So all of this, sorry if I interrupted you. You froze up for a second, and I thought you had stopped, but it turned out that you were just frozen.
Yeah, I was saying I'm also a venture capitalist, Bob.
I heard. So at Flagship, right? Which is and in the kind of health and sustainability space.
Yeah, we invent all the science at our companies, which is very rare. We do no outside investment at all. The partners, my peers, we have to think of around 100 new ideas a year, genuinely novel ideas, far-fetched hypotheses, like what if we hijack the body's messenger RNA so that we tricked your cells into making your own drugs? Or what if we coated seeds in microbiota that increased their yields? So the weirder the idea, the better. Every year, around 6 to 8 of those ideas that are so promising that we go and give them a initial commitment of around $20 to $50 million and begin to structure them for eventual independent life as standalone companies. Probably our best known companies are Moderna and Indigo. And I function as one of the partners at Flagship, creating new companies.
It kind of makes me wish I had a weird idea to shop right now. Maybe I'll think of one by the end of the conversation. So all of this explains why we're going to talk about various questions about technology in the future, ranging from the CRISPR gene editing technology. I'll probably ask you about 3D printing, and about this thing you wrote about in Wired, where this, as I understand it, this woman wants to create an app or something that might eventually let us read each other's thoughts, stuff like that. But first, I want to talk about an exchange we had on Twitter where you claimed that one thing you never feel, I guess you're constitutionally incapable of feeling, is offense. You don't take offense. You can't be offended. Is that right?
I don't fully understand what people mean when they say they're offended, though I take it for granted they are. But my bank account in the bank of social media is empty, is bankrupt. But perhaps it might be useful if you and I could agree on terms. What do you think offense consists of, Bob?
Well, let me say this. First of all, when you say you don't take offense, I think you're lying. Now, I don't really think you're lying. I just wanted to say that so I could ask, like, what do you feel when somebody says something like that? Like you're accused of dishonesty. Don't you have, I mean, apparently you didn't take me as seriously as I had hoped. But if you had taken me seriously, wouldn't you have some negative feeling?
I take offense to mean something like this, a sense of personal affront where a moral standard has been trespassed and it's somehow done me an injury, that I'm injured by someone else's moral trespass. And then I also think there's a kind of aesthetic repulsion as well that's attached to the feeling of offense. I know people feel this, but I find it really hard to believe that any modern person who isn't religious or doesn't have some faith-based system is ever really offended. I tend to take offense as being a kind of political theater where people are angling for a kind of primacy in the argument. But I myself am never really offended. In the Trump era, I have come as close as I am capable of feeling, which is a kind of an impatience and an irritation with the president. But even with Trump, I can't quite bring myself to feel fully offended.
I would say especially with Trump, I find it hard because it's hard to take him seriously enough in a certain sense to be, if it's like, but on the other hand, if there was somebody whose opinion I cared about who said and meant it, your book is dishonest, you plagiarize, or you're stupid, or that's a lie, and said it to me in public, I would have a negative reaction. Don't you have some negative affective reaction to that?
Not much. I think people, by and large, are going to feel what they're going to feel, and are going to argue what they're going to argue, and I wouldn't feel any personal sense of injury from someone attacking me. I'm trying to imagine this. If you said that my prose style, about which I labor, was terrible, that I was lacking in taste, that I was a purveyor of sham Augustan sonorities or something, I might feel mildly wounded. But that sense of being affronted, that you had actually injured me, I don't feel that.
Well, I do. I think I may kind of agree that the way offense is often expressed is a little disingenuous. I mean, first of all, sometimes people are just making it up, right? They're just like, it's just like they want to be seen as taking umbrage for whatever reason. But I think even aside from that, when people are like, if you say something to me that belittles me or something, the actual feeling will probably be something like anger or rage, but there are social conventions that might encourage me to make it all sound more high-minded, right? Like, how dare you? You know, and that, how dare you makes it sound like there's a feeling that's something other than raw anger or rage. But I think anger or rage is more like what it is, right? I mean, is that your issue, that you think we're calling it offense, but it's just something more pedestrian like anger?
I think I can imagine Bob feeling a sense of anger with someone who owed you a lot, or you had a great and close relationship with, who had failed in the relationship. But the sense of injury from the expression of a political statement or a religious statement or a scientific statement, I can't imagine feeling offended by that in the way that a pious Muslim might feel offended by an offense against the prophet, or a devout Christian might feel offended by someone expressing a belief in the right of abortion. I don't feel that way about any statement of belief.
Okay, well, this is a little different. Okay, so this is a little different from the example I gave, which is, what if someone insults you? That feels bad to you, right?
Feels, if I had a personal and close relationship with the person, if my oldest friend told me that I was a bad friend and that I had failed her in an important way, I might feel wounded and defensive. I can imagine myself saying, well, no, that's not true. I've always been there for you. But I think that's a slightly different emotion, a sense of feeling wounded and misunderstood than feeling offended aesthetically and politically and intellectually by the expression of a view that I didn't agree with. You see this all the time on social media. I'm quaking with rage. I'm rage tweeting as I speak. You see it in speeches all the time. It seems to be the currency of our time. I feel that I just don't share it in any meaningful way.
Yeah. I got to think, when you were editing Technology Review, if you heard somebody say that magazine really sucks, it was a bad feeling, right?
Well, they said it all the time. I mean, there was a strong sense amongst some readers that we were either being too technical for the general audience, and then there were other readers who, why have you strayed from your traditional role of just explaining the technology? Why are you providing us with the economic context or its potential social impact? And I would always think, well, says you. That's your opinion, and I must execute my mission according to my own lights as well as I can. But I can't remember ever being offended that someone attacked this property which I had invested myself in. In fact, whenever one of my writers would take umbrage at one of my edits, rather than my taking umbrage back, I would always mildly say back, well, when you're editor-in-chief, you can edit in the way that you want. But for the time being, this is my post that I must stand. And I think what you just did sucked. And let me tell you why. And you'll fix it, since I'm the boss for these circumstances.
And did that always work?
Because I would say it so mildly and without any offense and with the clear indication that I knew that this was simply me occupying my role. After a while, my staff kind of got used to it. I'm a very tough editor, always have been, but I think that's what editors do. They hammer a piece into shape, and I've always
either into shape or out of it, depending on the quality of the editor.
No, I was a bad editor. A good editor, and we need there as rare as a phoenix, right? A good editor allows you to speak in your own voice as fully as you can and sharpens the argument you would have made if you had been as smart as you should have been. And that's the editor I try to be.
Yeah, no, I've had some good editors, but there are non-great ones out there. So so let's turn to the future then. So you recently, or maybe this piece isn't up yet. You showed me a draft of it, I guess, for Wired, about a technology that you passed on, that Flagship passed on, decided not to invest in, I think both for maybe ethical reasons and kind of practical reasons in a sense. Now, it's a gene editing technology. Now, is this CRISPR per se, the much discussed CRISPR, or is it something different but related?
So there are a variety of ways you can edit genes. CRISPR-Cas9 is currently the most famous, but there are a couple of others called TALENs. There's another one called zinc fingers. And there are a few more CRISPR-based technologies that work on different pathways. It almost doesn't matter how you edit the individual nucleotides, though we do want a increasing accuracy and fineness. But yes, the great area of investment throughout life sciences at the moment is in editing genes. Now, most gene editing at the moment is what's called somatic, which means it's only editing body cells.
So in other words, it's not transmitted into the next generation, whatever you do to it.
It's not inheritable. But the great moral question of our age, about which people have fundamentally different moral intuitions, is whether we should edit the germline, eggs, sperm, or embryos, in order to eliminate disease and potentially confer advantages on future generations. And we had a great conversation about this at Flagship, and in the end declined to pursue it, even though I knew for a fact that a competing firm was thinking about it as we discussed it, and will, in a fairly short amount of time, announce they're going to have a startup to work in the area.
Now, can you explain how this technology would have worked at a practical level? So I gather it was a case where you could just scrape cells from like the inside of a cheek.
Yeah.
Is that right? And
so there are two combined technologies. One is called in vitro gametogenesis, or artificial gametes, where you can take any adult cell and induce it to become a stem cell, and then from a stem cell make it into, which are pluripotent, make it into an egg or a sperm. But to do that, Bob, requires such fine genetic tinkering with the gene editing techniques that since you're in at the cellular level anyway, it would be a very strong temptation, and in some people's opinion, a categorical imperative to fix any genetic defects you found while you were in there at the cellular level. So it's the combination of IVG, in vitro gametogenesis, plus CRISPR-Cas9 that changes what human reproduction has always been. Because suddenly, no one's infertile, couples of the same sex, or a parent of only one, can have children. And then while you're in there, you can certainly fix any monogenic diseases, any of the single gene defects like cystic fibrosis or Huntington's disease. But also one day you might be very strongly tempted to mess around with the polygenic conditions, and maybe even begin messing around with enhancing people as well. Yeah.
Now, and you passed on that because I think one thing you said in the piece is, often drugs and things, pharmaceuticals, whatever, all kinds of biotech things wind up having side effects you don't initially grasp. There's a period of testing, and you discover them. In this case, the test involves the creation of an actual person. So if the downside is discovered, it's discovered via ruining a life, and you didn't want to be part of that for both ethical and I guess reasons of liability as well. Yeah. Is that fair to say?
Well, that's right. I mean, you can think about this either as our being called to our highest obligations as life scientists, first do no harm, or you can think about it on the flip side as being a kind of commercial liability. But we wanted no part in a therapeutic whose first dose would be a human being. So all drugs fail at some level, and 97% of new drugs fail outright, and they evolve through a process that's very much like natural evolution. There's selection, there's variation in selection, and eventually you end up something which may or may not work. But with genome-wide editing, you wouldn't know until the person was well into puberty or perhaps adulthood. And that just struck us as profoundly immoral, that we wouldn't know what the risk was for decades. And it wasn't even because of some, Kantian idea that the people involved hadn't consented to it. Children don't consent to all sorts of things, but it was based on a fundamental fact that we were at the very beginning of the biological century, and people are proposing messing around with human inheritance, knocking genes out, upregulating other genes, and we have no idea on Earth why most of these genes work. There are all these wrecker genes, they're called, Bob, which in late age, because of a process called antagonistic pleiotropy, kind of wreck you. But they've been conserved for a reason, insofar as nature has a reason. There's a famous one called DAF2. DAF2 is a gene kind of is implicated in aging and senescence, but you also need it for embryonic development. So there are lots of genes like that, and we just didn't want to get involved in messing around at this stage with things we didn't understand.
Right. You use the term pleiotropy, which means a gene having more than one effect, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And often a gene that has an upside also actually has a downside. And in fact, one theory of why we age is that natural selection, the way it tends to handle that trade-off is it favors genes that have the good effects relatively early. And if there's going to be bad effects, it wants the genes that have the bad effects down the road. And in effect, you wind up with all the bad effects kicking in at a certain age. Yeah. The analogy used is when supposedly Henry Ford said, are there any parts that just aren't wearing out in our car? And somebody said, yeah, this thing never wears out. And he said, okay, we'll make it cheaper. In other words, as long as, you concentrate the death of all the parts in the same area. So anyway, that's just a long-winded way of saying that your caution seems well advised, since gene, you pull at one end and something else is going to come out at another end, so to speak.
I'm absolutely sure that's the case. I mean, there are lots of examples of that, from sickle cell anemia to a whole variety of other genes. And we just felt really cautious about it. One of my partners looked at me in the eye as we were discussing this, and he called this genome-wide editing a moral and therapeutic dead end. He was a physician, and he shook his head and he said, it's wrong. It's just absolutely wrong. And we talked our way through it, and even though we love far-fetched hypotheses, this was a far-fetched hypothesis that we just couldn't see how we would ever get it into a clinic in the way that we would feel morally and commercially comfortable with.
Right. But it does seem to me this stuff is going to happen. When James Watson was made head of the Human Genome Project, I wrote a cover story about him for the New Republic. I remember the title had a picture of him, and the title on the cover was "Mad Scientist?" Because he is such an odd guy and was already saying the kinds of controversial things that eventually lost him that job.
Yeah.
But one thing I said in the piece is, like, in the old days, eugenics was something, 100 years ago, that could only happen if some centralized authority kind of made it happen, like the government mandated that people who didn't pass some IQ tests couldn't reproduce, or, eugenics was a centralized thing. And it seems like now with the modern technology, it's kind of the opposite, in the sense that, somebody somewhere is going to try to take advantage of it. And when these things, in the cases where it seems pretty likely to pay off, affluent people will presumably be the ones who can afford to experiment with it. And so it's going to happen unless the government steps in and stops it from happening. And even then, you're going to have to get all the governments in the world to agree, or it's going to happen somewhere. And once it starts happening anywhere, there's an incentive for people to let it happen elsewhere, so that the other country doesn't start breeding some super race that vanquishes your people. You know what I mean? It seems to me that the logic is almost inescapable, that the kinds of things you sidestepped, your company sidestepped, chose not to be a part of, are going to become real.
I'm absolutely certain, Bob, that someone's going to try this somewhere, and I know that because they already have.
Yeah, the guy in China, the Chinese scientist. I don't know what his status is now. What happened with that?
He is under house arrest. He is not allowed to leave his apartment building, and the whole experiment is shut down. And he may come under some kind of criminal prosecution. But I think you said something really interesting there. You talked about government controlling. So government can provide a kind of a regulatory framework, but in the end, I really take seriously the argument that consumers, parents, have a right to provide their children with the healthiest outcomes they can. And that if we have some of these genetic technologies, parents should be able to buy them. So we have another company called Ohana, which approaches this question, we think, from a more reliable and more ethical point of view. So rather than gene editing, we improve the health of sperm and allow fathers to select the healthiest sperm from their ejaculate. So you're kind of doing the same thing, potentially. You're selecting traits, but you're only selecting effectively naturally occurring traits. So you're not getting into the business of knocking out or upregulating genes. But I'm sufficiently a liberal that I want parents to be able to make those decisions. I feel uncomfortable when governments are doing eugenics, but I think it's a good thing for parents to want to go and eliminate.
But if you let individuals do that, and the government doesn't step in and at least pay for anyone who wants to do it right, then you're going to wind up with this sharp genetic stratification by social class, because the poor people won't be able to afford it. So it seems to me this is a case for national health care covering this. I don't think there are many people who welcome the prospect of a society in which lower income levels harbor all of the genetically transmitted diseases, whereas the upper classes are perfectly healthy in that regard, let alone the fact that the distinction between, stopping a pathology and genetic enhancement is not always as clear cut as you might like. And there's good reason to believe that in any event, that's going to be a slippery slope. So if you start letting parents, increase the various faculties of their children, whether athleticism or intelligence or whatever, and the government isn't, giving anyone who wants to do it the financial wherewithal, you're going to wind up with what strikes most of us as an extremely creepy scenario. And by the way, even if the government does that, there may be some people who choose not to participate, and they will then turn themselves into a distinct genetic class given long enough, right? Assuming that attitude itself transmits to their children. We needn't get into that last one, but you take the point that this is going to get messy.
Well, you just made a original moral argument for why a nationalized healthcare system might be mandatory. If you think people hate the 1% now, and if you think envy of the 1% is driving a great deal of social turmoil, imagine how they're going to feel when our children, their children, someone's children, have all these genetic advantages. They don't get sick, they're taller, they run faster, their bones don't break, they have better concentration. That would be a world of helots and Spartans, wouldn't it? It would be dreadful. So in that futurist scenario, you will either require some kind of nationalized healthcare or a completely different way of subscribing to therapies where everyone had equal access. Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good argument why, as we enter the biological century, we have to go and change the way we use these things.
Now we've been talking about parents choosing these things to do, to make their kids better in a particular sense, free of pathologies, and then aside from that, capable of excelling in sports and so on. We haven't talked about therapeutic uses. I mean, for example, maybe your kid would be happy if they didn't take offense, right? Maybe we can make everyone like you, and they'll, and then that the world will be a more peaceful place, or less prone to rage, anxiety, sadness. And then, of course, there's the question of two questions. I mean, doesn't sadness, all kinds of questions, but the two categories are, Well, but it doesn't have a downside for the person. If they never get sad, don't they fail to understand that a particular pathway isn't working out? And then there's the externalities problem, right? These people who aren't worried about blowback, right? Because they are not pained by people's negative reactions. They become a total pain. I'm not saying you're one, by the way, but you know what I mean, right? It's like people who take too many SSRIs and are like a problem at the corporate meeting, you know?
Well, this is Huxley wrote about this, right? The hero wants a world of pain and difficulty and frustration because emotion and disappointment and diversity are part of human nature. I mean, when I think about all these things, what I guess I most worry about is many of the things that I value in life are often strongly correlated with maybe disadvantageous mental states, depression, anxiety, are strongly correlated with creativity and originality. And I worry about a world where parents would, for perfectly good reasons, say, you know what, all things considered, I've had terrible problems with depression all my life. You know, I would like my girl not to go and suffer from that. But I imagine a creative world that was kind of flattened out at some level, that lacked some of the bright colors that depressed people can sometimes bring to it.
Mm-hmm. So before we move on to another subject, tell me, what is it about CRISPR that is raising all these new questions? I mean, certain forms of enhancing the germline, you could say, have long been available just via selective reimplantation after the genetic testing of, cells conceived in vitro. And so you can certainly get rid of pathologies that way, and people have, and I'm sure there are some pathologies that are less common as a result. Of course, in some societies, this changes the sex ratio because there's such a preference for males, and so on. So is CRISPR the first thing that lets us, what does it let us do that nothing else has let us do?
It's two vectors coming together. On the one hand, we have increasing clarity in what genes do. They were still at the very beginning of understanding this. And at the same time, we've been given a tool that is easy, that's cheap. Someone with a bachelor's degree in biology and a cheap $10,000 machine can edit individual nucleotides and knock out a gene or scissor it and insert another gene. It's just easy. And I think the wonder and the terror of CRISPR-Cas9 is that it can be used to create extraordinary new drugs like these chimeric antigen receptor drugs, the CAR-T drugs that can cure cancers. But at the same time, you can also use CRISPR for gene drives to knock out an entire species or for biological warfare.
Right.
And the terror and the wonder of the current moment is that we understand a little, and we've been given 50 years too early, a tool that makes us much more powerful than our understanding. And much more
early in the sense of what? It's outrun what?
It's outrun both our understanding of genetics, what these genes are actually doing phenotypically in total, and it's also outrun our moral evolution. So we're still a bunch of technology using apes and warring polarized tribes who don't get on, and we've been given a tool to control ourselves and control other people.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the problems with being a bunch of warring apes is that we don't even have time to focus seriously on the policy issues. I mean, you look, American politics is such a nightmare of like bullshit right now that nobody, the biological warfare is a perfect example. I mean, I think I wrote about this a long time ago on Slate, but I mean, I think if you look at these kinds of technologies, as you noted, the problem with them is that they're so accessible that you don't need to build some kind of huge nuclear power plant size thing to do them. The machinery is going to become more and more available. More and more people are able to do it. I think for starters, I mean, leaving aside the fact that ultimately you need an international agreement or there will be some place where it's done, even aside from that, it's a challenge. I think you should have a situation where possession of this machinery without it being registered and monitored in real time, what you're doing with it being monitored in real time electronically is illegal. You have to have a license, and to have one, even with a license, it has to be monitored in real time, all of its activities. I can't imagine a regime very short of that has that gives us a very high confidence of averting global catastrophe, and yet no one is talking about this.
I think about it, if not every 20 seconds. I think about it all the time, and I think the regime that you have sketched is what will be the only responsible one. These machines we need to know where every single one is, and we need to know in real time what it's being used for. You shouldn't be able to turn it on without having applied for some internal review board process and explain the changes you were going to make, even if it was you were using it only for experimental processes. The Chinese experiment was just the beginning. There are 12 papers that exist in the world at the moment that we know about that describe embryo or germline interventions. All of them, with a couple of exceptions, were in China, that has no regulatory regime at all for any of this.
But at least they're taking it seriously enough to arrest the guy. You know, I guess that's something. I don't know if that's a public relations concern or what, but.
Yeah. I feel this stuff all the time. And I guess what I'd say to your audience, Bob, is that in the end, just as ordinary citizens took on board the anxiety of nuclear war, we need to do a similar thing in the biological era and become politically involved in the decisions we're making about our food and our bodies and the medicines we're taking. It's going to be a tremendously disruptive period. And I use this metaphor of a technology appearing 50 years too early. It really feels like that to me. It feels like a technology fell out of the sky before we had quite accommodated to itself. Normally, the tools keep pace with our understanding. And in fact, the tools are often the generator of the understanding. In this case, our understanding lags. And we've been given this incredibly powerful tool, which we really don't know what we're doing with it. And I think that is a kind of a uniquely worrying moment in technological history. You called me a kind of a futurist earlier, and my ability to see into the future, there's a kind of a scrim, a blur that occurs about 10 years out, because I find it really difficult to see through that miasma about how we're going to match our biological understanding and our moral evolution to our sudden godlike power.
Well, maybe it's the singularity that you're having trouble seeing. By definition, we can't see past the singularity, right?
Yeah. What does Stuart Brand say? We are all gods now, and we had better get used to it.
Yeah. I'm not sure I like it, but so let's. I said we'd talk about another technology that is in some ways scary, which is 3D printing. One way I encounter this is whenever on Twitter I say that, look, one sensible form of gun control would be just limit the size of magazines, and I think Democrats just introduced a bill that would do this to 8 bullets, 10 bullets, whatever. And then at least, that's no problem for hunters. It's no problem for self-defense in your home. And at least it makes it a little harder for terrorists to do those super mass casualty attacks because they have to keep reloading and maybe someone will take them down or something will go wrong. And invariably someone tweets and says, don't you understand that with 3D printing, they can just make the magazine? So I'm curious. Of course, in theory, you could regulate 3D printing, but leaving that aside, I'm curious as to your view of how close these people are to being on target. Like, how close are we to the day where gun regulations will be undermined by 3D printing assuming that technology is not itself regulated, or the dissemination of the kind of intellectual property that, the algorithms that generate certain things on 3D properties is regulated?
About 18 months to 2 years. I mean, not long at all.
Like a solid gun of your own designing, yeah. And then you just send the recipe to whoever else has the 3D printer, and they can do it.
18 months. 3D printing was always this disappointing technology. I mean, it goes back as an idea 35 years because there was a gap in the middle of 3D printing. We could print polymers, plastics, with a kind of an extrusion device, just like you do ordinary printing layer upon layer. And you could do that for tchotchkes, for hobbyist stuff, but it was all in plastic. And that was cheap and it was interesting. And then on the other end, the other bookend, big companies like General Electric had these multi-million-dollar machines that had to operate in a vacuum and that produced explosive combinations of metals unless they were carefully monitored. And they would use that to make plane parts. Mm-hmm. But almost everything that humanity wants to make and makes are smaller metal parts in the middle. And for a variety of tedious technical reasons, that was really hard to do until the last literally 18 months, 2 years. And then a couple of companies like Desktop Printing have managed to make machines that cost between $10,000 to $100,000 that can print any part that you want in any material. So that is
What's the limit of size on these machines? How big can the part be?
They can be as small as a tiny ball bearing or a screw, or they can be as large as an aeroplane prop. Certainly as large as any of the parts that go into a gun. So this age of biological insight and control that I describe in the life sciences is simultaneously appearing in the material sciences. So one way to think about the 21st century is, if in the 20th century we had all these emerging digital abilities, we're beginning to have the same degree of write and read control in the material world, both of macromolecules, biology, and these small molecules in material science. And that's very interesting and spooky and weird.
It is kind of spooky. Now there was this case not long ago where a guy, he was poised to disseminate an algorithm for, I think, creating a gun via 3D printing. He was making a First Amendment case that this is freedom of speech. And I don't suppose you asked for my view on this, but my feeling is this isn't what the founding fathers had in mind. But anyway, when they wrote the First Amendment, but anyway, I don't know. I lost track of that. Like, do you know what happened?
Yeah, I mean, if I recall what happened, it was not thought to be a First Amendment issue, a speech issue. But it was thought to come under the Second Amendment, and
it was the Second Amendment issue.
Well, he was saying both, bizarrely, as a kind of a weird cyber libertarian.
Yeah,
and I don't think the First Amendment argument got very far because there's all sorts of harm principle issues which constrain his speech. But you can certainly share information about how to build a gun in a book, and then build a gun, and you have the right to bear and keep that weapon. I mean, I think a lot of these things are out of the bag, and I think the same principle that you described for how we would regulate gene editing machines probably also have to be applied to 3D printers as well. There could be a whole list of products that you needed a license.
Right.
And insurance to make. So as a free market guy, the easiest way to go and regulate these things wouldn't just be licensing, but to go and impose a market control. You may only have a machine that can print gunmetal parts if you take on a portion of the liability. and pay for the potential risk of these machines. But these are the issues we haven't discussed. So
in other words, you would be responsible for what is done with a gun that comes out of your machine?
Yeah, at some level, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that, no, we don't need to get too legalistic. I think the Second Amendment would not ultimately carry much weight in the sense that obviously any gun control legislation you can impose in the first place, any regulation you can impose in the first place has to be consistent with the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
And if you realize that regulation by regulating 3D printing, I don't see how that can be a Second Amendment problem. It's more just a question of how difficult the enforcement actually becomes, right?
Yeah. And Bob, it's not just guns. There are all sorts of other things you can make with 3D printers. Bombs. There are tons of dangerous
things that plainly are regulatable in accordance with the standard reading of the Second Amendment right now, like automatic weapons, even machine guns,
which have always been regulated, at least since the 1930s. And suddenly, because everyone potentially has a little factory in their home, or at least access to a factory, it's all these regulatory controls that really regulated purchasing and selling are suddenly moot. Mm-hmm. So what we need to do is regulate manufacturing and gene editing. We have to go and take the regulation down a level to the end user, which we haven't had to do before.
Yeah, although ultimately there has to be a regulating authority. I mean, however, to whatever extent you harness the market, it's the government demanding that you do that. And, of course, that freaks some people out. In the case of guns, the people most freaked out by any substantial degree of government regulation are the same people who are most resisting gun regulation to begin with. So it's kind of messy. I mean, I'm not getting more optimistic about the human prospect, I must admit, as I speak to you. Is this a common reaction to speaking to you?
I hope I don't make people gloomy. I mean, there are wonderful reasons to be excited and happy. All these cancers that had been fatal sentences even a short time ago are now curable. These devastating psychological diseases, which had been, if not death sentences, at least death sentences for hope. It seems that we might be on the verge of making meaningful interventions. We worried 50 years ago that we would be able to feed a planet of 7 billion people. And I'm confident we can feed as many as we want. And we're giving people tools to create new forms of art. There are wonderful reasons to be optimistic. But as any period where you get powerful new technologies, we just have to discuss them and ask what we want from them so that we can use technology rather than be used by it.
Yeah, I guess maybe some of the new forms of art will kind of take the sting out of the apocalypse. I'm feeling better. I said we would talk about this third thing. You wrote about this woman who, I guess she gave a TED talk about this. She's got a company that does something with some kind of brain imaging thing or something. But one possible application was going to be that people could look into each other's minds and get some kind of sense of, I mean, eventually down the road, of what the other person is thinking. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, her name is Mary Lou Jepson. She's been a figure in Silicon Valley for 30 years. She was the first chief technology officer for the One Laptop Per Child project. She headed up the display technology groups for both Facebook and Google. She's a holographic scientist by background, and she has a new company called OpenWater that uses holography to beam red light into the human body at an incredibly fine level of resolution. And there are some obvious and non-dramatic therapeutic uses of that. You can very cheaply do MRI. So rather than having a $500,000 machine, African and Indian villages could have wands that could see cancers. But it turns out to have a slightly alarming side effect. The resolution is finer than a neuron. So in principle, we know from other experiments that you would be able to see at least some thoughts. So there's another professor at the University of Berkeley who has reliably seen thoughts using a similar technology that are images. And there's no reason to believe that there are thoughts other than images that would not be readable as well. I love Mary Lou. I've known her for many years. She's one of my favorite people. But when she talked to me about this, I looked at her with genuine alarm. The fear that you felt a few moments ago when you were talking to me about 3D printing, I felt about this, because everything I care about in life, whether it's art or marriage or love or science, is based upon secrets and privacy. And I found it very difficult to imagine what my humanity would be if my thoughts were, this is where the name of the company comes from, were as open as water. Mary Lou Jepsen imagines us swimming in an ocean together where our thoughts are visible to one another. And I said to her, you're talking about the death of love. And she said, oh, I wouldn't put it that strongly. I'm talking about our next evolution. And I said,
why did you think this entailed the death of love?
Because love is based at some level upon
not telling them the truth about how you feel about them.
No, not there being an essential mystery to another person, but their personhood being separate from mine, complementary to me, and our being in a conversation like you and I are together. Love is possible when two distinct individuals enter into a moment for however brief a rapturous accord, where they come near to each other while remaining separate. And the excitement and the thrill is of still remaining separate, yearning individuals. And if my thoughts were entirely transparent to yours, I wonder how distinct my personality would remain.
Well, not to mention the fact that the process of sharing associated with love, right? The communications that establish the commonalities and the contrasts, that's part of the thing, right? I mean, it's like doing that through the normal human conduits of communication that are intertwined with love. If you just read the reading, the way a radiologist does, that might be different.
Whether it's the discovery of romantic love or it's the process of teaching your child, there's an effort of strenuous effort in human conversation. This is what I mean. This is what you mean. And I imagined a world without privacy wouldn't contain that. You know the little Wittgensteinian thought experiment, right, where everyone has a box with a thing inside it, and no one knows whether the beetle inside their box looks like another person's beetle or is a beetle at all. And Wittgenstein calls that the language game. And that's how we communicate. But there wouldn't really be language games in the same way.
Right.
In a world where my thoughts were entirely transparent to yours. Of everything I've seen, Bob, in the last 3 years, including CRISPR, including 3D printing, the thing that most freaked me out was open water. I said at the beginning that we're apes who evolve through technology, but there's something about us that remains kind of irremediably human. And I wondered what we would be like if we could really read each other's thoughts in the way that Mary Lou Jepsen blithely imagines.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the least freaked out by this of the three, but I think that's because I'm not really taking it seriously. What is the state of the what is the current state of the image reading? Like you referred to a technology that allows people to look at something or other, an MRI or whatever it is, and guess with, I guess, some accuracy what actual image, what object the person is thinking of. Is that right?
Yeah, I've seen this. It's at the resolution of a bad fuzzy film. So if a person lies inside an MRI, a functional MRI at the moment, we can, with a fair degree of resolution, tell if he's being shown a picture of a cat or 747 or an elephant galloping. So you can see at that level of resolution.
And it's not that the image itself shows up in the reading, but it's that there are certain patterns of brain activation associated with with thinking of an animal running as opposed to something else.
Yeah, and we're getting into deep philosophical grounds here, but the hard problem in consciousness might suggest that there are things that just couldn't be translated, which gives me a bit of hope. So qualia that were specific to you, could a smell and all the associations with a smell, would Proust's Madeleine be translatable using this technology?
Well, yeah, I mean, there is that problem in principle of I remember when I was about 9 years old, sitting around with some friends talking, and maybe we had been watching an episode of The Twilight Zone or something. But I remember when we first thought, like, how do I know that what I see when I see red is what you see when you see red? I got like chills. Yeah. It was like it was so, and that problem does seem like a possibly insurmountable problem with all of these things. Like when you see an elephant running and so on, regardless of technology, right?
So the reason why I have calmed myself about my existential fears about love, when Mary Lou Jepson described this, is I can't help but feel that my elephant would be, at some profound level, qualitatively different from your elephant, and that my selfness would not be overthrown by people being able to perceive my thoughts. And when you talk to Mary Lou Jepson about this, she also talks about regulation. Mm-hmm. She's saying people would have to opt in to sharing. Though, of course, as soon as she said that, I saw the possibility of the use of this technology for coercion and control and military.
And in principle, the person wouldn't have to cooperate. I mean, in principle, I could have a scanner that I point to you, and you're not even point at you, and you're not even aware of it, and it does this. That is in principle possible.
I could eavesdrop on you without your even knowing that I had hacked your brain.
Okay.
And your thoughts.
Well, I mean, if people aren't depressed now, I give up. We've done our best. And maybe we should have another conversation where we try to cheer them up.
Well, let's do it again, and let me go and choose 3 technologies for you that make me feel wonder and awe at human inventiveness.
Okay, I'll tell you, here's what we'll do. You'll come up with those technologies. You'll give me a little advance notice, and I will come up with reasons to be depressed even by them.
You're on.
I'm good at that kind of thing. So I encourage people to Google Jason Pontin and Wired, because then a list of all the pieces you've written for Wired in the ideas section will pop up. Is there any place else you would send them for your stuff? Well, you're on Twitter. What is your Twitter handle?
It is Jason_Pontin.
Pontin.
Pontin. And I was the editor-in-chief, as you say, of Technology Review for 13 years. And there are lots of pieces by me on there, one of which will appeal to your audiences about free speech in the internet era.
Right, and you've written about some of that for Wired too, so people should look up that. On Twitter, I am Robert Reiter, WRIGHTER. I was not editor of a magazine for any length of time, so I can't steer you in any archives. But and then the name of your company again is Flagship what?
Flagship Pioneering. We create companies in life sciences.
So if people have a great idea for a ruinous technology and want you to fund it,
Yeah.
we know where to go.
Well, we invent most of our own science, but sure.
Oh, you do? Okay, so I want to be clear on that. This is not a standard VC model where people come to you and you support their company?
The last traditional venture capital investment we made was in Editas, the big CRISPR company.
Right.
Since our beginning and recently 100%, the partners invent all the science and technology, working with our young associates and principals. We have this really unique model. We come up with these ideas, and if they're plausible, we send them into the lab for a year or two as a prototype, we call them. And if the science can be validated, we give them a $20 million commitment, and we try and grow it into a multi-billion-dollar IPO independent company. But what we say is, if you want unreasonable returns, then why invest in a reasonable way? And we find that when we opened our doors and said, hey, what ideas do you have? We got adjacent ideas. We got ideas that were adjacent to what people were already doing. And that just wasn't interesting to us, the scientists. And, our biggest resource constraint isn't money. We have, $3 billion under management. We can invest in what we want. The biggest resource constraint is what do we spend our time on? And if I've only got a limited amount of time, I'd prefer to do something that would have a 10x improvement on human outcomes than to do something that just makes us a bit of money. And everyone at Flagship is mission driven. We would like to go and solve big, interesting problems and expand human capabilities in an unusual way.
Okay, well, good. Well, then maybe you can solve some of the challenges technology creates, as well as doing the ordinary things. So get busy thinking about those 3 technologies that are going to cheer me up, and then we'll do this again. So thanks for taking the time, Jason.
Thank you, Bill.